in my life as a chaplain. So first, Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies growth and our freedom. In between stimulus and response, there is a space. We get to choose what happens in that space. In 2009, I was a summer chaplain at Women and Infants Hospital in Providence. On one day, I walked down the hall and into the room of a young 11-year-old girl who was living with cancer. She was in the end stages. Her diagnosis was terminal. There was nothing anybody could do anymore to help save this 11-year-old girl. I'm going to call her Allie. I expected to walk into the room and find a lot of heartbreak, a lot of grief. I expected wailing and distress. And what I found was a family who was calm and present. I found a young girl who was sitting in her bed reading a book, and her parents were sitting bedside ready to tell the story of their daughter, Allie, who left heart prints along the way. In that space between stimulus and response, Allie chose to sink into her heart and be present to the countless people coming through those doors to wish her well. For those brave enough to walk into the room and be present to the reality that this 11-year-old girl was going to die. For those who had the courage to step through that door, they found Allie, ready to leave a print on their heart of compassion and courage. This young 11-year-old girl changed my life. Heart prints along the way is what her family would say about Allie. She left heart prints along the way. That was the way in which this family made meaning of something so horrific, a young girl dying. And that was the identity that this family chose to carry with them in those days and into the future. The story of how Allie was present to each person who came into that room with love and compassion. Fast forward many years later, after 12 years of parish minister in central Maine, I made a decision that I wanted to be spiritual boots on the ground where it would matter the most, where folks were the most marginalized and the most left behind. I decided I was going there. I was going to bring my heart and my compassion and my desire to be present to the suffering and the despair by going there. I started my trip by first stopping at the Veterans Administration in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for a year-long residency, a chaplain residency. I was a clinical chaplain serving our veterans who were living with chronic and complex mental illness from their times in service. I was walking alongside veterans who were figuring out what to do with their substance use. I spent my days at the hospital walking alongside veterans who were ill and veterans who were having behavioral health concerns that created risk to themselves or others, and they were living their days in a locked facility. One day I walked into the room to a man who was 90 years old or so. He was in his 90s. I walked into the room, and I'm going to call him Joe. I walked into Joe's room, and Joe's sitting on the side of his bed with his hospital gown partially on, partially off. He looked quite confused. His hair was disheveled. He looked like he didn't know what was going on. And as I walked in the room, a little pensive, I knocked on the door and said, "Hello, I'm Chaplain Carie. May I come in?" And Joe's immediate response was to shove this adult depend my way and say to me, "I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it." And I said, "Well, let me see if I can help. What do you think you need to do with that?" "They told me to put it on, but I don't know how to put it on. They told me I had to put it on, but I don't know how it works." And I said, "Well, let's see what we can do about that. Let me see if I can get us some help. I'll press the nurse's button and I'll call and I'll see if someone will come." "They don't want to help me. I'm one of the deplorables. They don't want to help me." In the religious rhetoric that we toss around, there was one of our 90-year-old veterans in complete despair, confused by a depend, claiming the identity that was meant to hurt and harm and push others away, to keep the stranger at a distance, to keep the other over there. Just the opposite of Allie. Allie invited people in and opened her heart and said, "I am glad you are here." Joe felt diminished, dehumanized, lost, and alone by his circumstances and political rhetoric that said he wasn't worthy. Now, our first principle tells us everybody is worthy of dignity and respect. And so there I stood, face to face with exactly the reason I went to the VA. I wanted to figure out how to show up with folks like Joe, because I too was a victim of the rhetoric in the world that said, "Hold the distance." And there I was with a man who was pushing me away and gave me permission to walk out the room. But that was why I went to the VA. I knew I would find my uncomfortable places, and I could make a choice between the stimulus and my response. Would I choose to run, or would I choose to stay? I chose to stay. I said, "Well, let me grab a chair." No, wait, first, before I said that, what I said to him was, "What do you mean by deplorable, Joe?" "You know what deplorable means." And I said, "But I want to know what it means to you." And I said, "But before you start, let me get a chair." So I looked around and found me a folding chair and set it up, and he said, "Before you sit down, grab my bag." Over there on his bedside table, I found a bag. It was one of those drawstring bags that you put around your back. It looked tattered and torn and like he'd been carrying it around for years. I sat down at the table next to him, at the bed next to him, and I said, "So tell me what deplorable means to you." He was done with that conversation. He said, "Open up that bag." And so we sat down and we opened up this bag, and he pulled out a book that he claimed he had been carrying around for years. And by the looks of the book, he had been carrying it around for years. I don't remember what the book was. I don't remember why that book was important to him. But what I remember was he had been carrying it around for years. And when he came to the hospital to get help, that's the only thing he brought. He opened up the book, he took out a letter, and he talked about the letter. But then he brought out some pictures. He pulled out first a picture of himself as a young man in his army fatigues, must have been in his early 20s when he first enlisted. He then brought out a picture of him and his mother on that day he had enlisted. A picture of him and his brother and his mother, and then there was his auntie, and then there were a few more pictures, but all of those pictures were about 40 or 50 years old. They went back to his early days. And so as he pulled out those pictures one by one, he would tell me a story of his mother, and then a story of his father, and the story of his auntie. And by the time the 20 minutes had passed, Joe had humanized us both. Through telling his stories, through relating his life experience, through centering his heart and my heart on the early days, he humanized both of us. We connected heart to heart. In that decision to show up, to say, "I see you," to say, "I hear you," we entered into a relationship. It was no longer the strangers in the room and Joe trying to push me out the door. It was that moment that Allie created over and over and over again. Heart to heart, we connected through his story, through his despair, and through his joy. We can enter into those spaces through our mind. Had I entered that room with my mind open rather than my heart open, I might have entered into a different conversation with Joe. But the minute he called himself a deplorable, my heart broke open and we entered into a heart-to-heart conversation rather than a head-to-head conversation. Together, we journeyed through his 90-plus years. And in his willingness to be vulnerable, he humanized both of us. There's a spiritual and moral mandate that comes with our first principle, to respect respect the dignity of everyone. There's a spiritual and moral mandate that somehow we move through our own discomfort, our own desire to push people away, to call someone a stranger, to use political rhetoric to create distance. But how do we do it? It's not easy. I'll tell you, it was much easier for me with Joe to create that heart-to-heart moment than it is when someone I love in my family throws some rhetoric around. Much harder then. Much harder in those moments to move from my head down to my heart and open it up and say, "I love you, I see you, I hear you. Let's walk in this together. Let us be together in this. You are not alone. A much harder place. So I don't stand here saying, I've got the answer. I stand here saying, I had a moment that it helps me, motivates me to show up in that spiritual and moral mandate that we give ourselves in our first principle to love, respect, and provide a dignified interaction with others. The best way I know how to do that is to keep showing up when it's uncomfortable, when our own despair is in the room, when our own desire to run fast is real, to keep showing up, to keep saying, I see you, I hear you, and sinking into the heart for a heart conversation rather than a head-to-head engagement. People change through the heart, then through the head. We change through the heart to heart and then through the mind. I call this the grace of love. Rabbi Sharon Brose calls it the amen effect. The amen effect, when our relationship creates that moment where a blessing, a grace, a generous love emerges in the relationship where we might have thought otherwise. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. I invite you to choose how you use it. Amen and blessed be. And our opportunity to use it is now, as we join together to sing Standing on the Side of Love. Before we go there, I just want to say that this song has additional lyrics to it that are called Answering the Call to Love. Michael invited